Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we exclusively look at 3D Blu-rays, almost entirely focusing on the quality of the 3D on offer, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at The Hole, Joe Dante's 2009 family-friendly horror film. The aspect ratio here is 1.85 to 1, and since this film was made before Avatar was released, it's one of the few films from the modern digital era of 3D that probably wasn't part of the post-James Cameron 3D boom. Also, it was made in a time before post-converted 3D had become a thing, meaning that this one was filmed with 3D cameras on the set. It's really only big-budget films, I think, that get post-converted 3D, as the process is probably too expensive for films of the Hole's budget. I've read that serious conversions like the Marvel films have can cost around $50,000 per minute, and that would add up to something like half the entire budget of this film, so it's much cheaper to shoot in native 3D. And it's worth mentioning that the stereographer on this film was the well-respected Max Penner, who's been working in 3D films for at least 30 years, and he's been responsible for the stereoscopy in several high-quality native 3D films, including Drive Angry and Dark Country. With this in mind, the fact that I'm going to be talking about the work of a man with 3 decades experience under his belt, and who's perhaps amongst the best at what he does, I always try to remember that the 3D on show is probably exactly how the filmmakers intended it to look. And so if some idiot on the internet, i.e. me, wants to criticise it, then he's really doing so from a point of view of ignorance. And I accept that criticism completely, but still think it's worth observing where I think the 3D succeeds and where perhaps I think that it doesn't. So at the start of the film we get a typical telltale sign that this is a native 3D production, because the reflection on the side of this lamp here causes a mild conflict in that there's more reflection in the right eye view than the left eye view. It's not a problem at all, and it's something that doesn't happen with conversions though, which though of course can suffer from all sorts of other problems. And there's another shot that hints the film is natively shot, which is this mesh gate, and there's nothing particularly special or interesting about it, but it's the kind of thing that a post-converted 3D film presumably wouldn't want to really deal with, as it would make for a large amount of effort to make it look like the buildings behind it are sitting in the correct space. Also early on there's a nice example of how the 3D here is being used in a genuinely artistic way. In this shot the sense of depth really does help to convey the empty space in the room, which is in a house that the family has just moved into. So shots like this ought to be the kind of thing that 3D naysayers should look at and think about, I think, before dismissing the process as a gimmick. Now, seeing as I just mentioned gimmick shots, I'm happy to report that this film doesn't shy away from them. In fact, this one here, looking down on the kid throwing a baseball up into the air, is so overt that it's comical. It's almost certainly intentionally so. It brings to mind the ludicrous paddleball shot from House of Wax, to which I think it may even be some sort of homage, because come to think of it, both shots feature balls not just coming towards us, but slowing down before they reach us, and then going back the way they came, then coming back again, staying in frame all of the time, which is more satisfying for 3D than if it was just a ball coming towards us before disappearing out of frame. Another film actually that does that even better, I think, is the top-down juggling scene in Robert Zemeckis' The Walk. And it looks to me also in this shot like the 3D was ramped up a bit, as there's a huge amount of depth here even without the ball. It's actually one of several top-down shots in the film where the 3D looks to be stronger than usual, and I assume this is because the interaxial was increased a little bit for these shots, although I do wonder if maybe that's an illusion, that the top-down shots always naturally look strong in 3D. I'm going to go with my initial feeling that they did ramp it up a little bit, because these other top-down shots, the increased depth really does help to heighten the drama, and I think top-down shots in films are typically used for dramatic reasons, even in 2D films. So these moments are definitely enhanced by having a very strong sense of 3D, which heightens the height, so to speak. So I said there were a few of what some would call gimmick shots, pop-outs, and I find films do these best when they're done slowly, which in most films they're not. So these nails falling into the hole are especially effective because it's a slow motion shot, and it's the same thing with this can as it's being lowered down on a fishing line. There's plenty of time to appreciate the 3D, which is not only really pleasing, but its slow speed is entirely valid within the story being told. And what I mean by that is that some films will linger on a pop-out shot or slow it down just to sort of hold on the 3D effect, and that does draw the accusation of a gimmick, but here the shot is completely legitimate. There's a shot that I love in 3D films where the camera is low to the ground, with the foreground right up close as the ground stretches back deep into the frame. When done nicely, which it is here, it's always very effective at showing off the power of 3D in both negative and positive parallax without having to do anything obvious. A lot of the time the composition seems to me to be clearly having 3D in mind. The framing on the Z-axis frequently places plenty of things in the foreground, middle ground and background, all of which keeps the 3D interesting. A busy frame is always likely to make for good 3D, and it seems that they've given plenty of consideration to that here. For me personally, my favourite type of 3D is hyperstereo, which is when the distance between the lenses is significantly greater than the separation between human eyes. Which gives us views that are impossible to see in reality, such as this street view here, where I'm guessing the lenses were as far apart as whatever rig they were using would allow them to place them. And I think that cityscapes, or I guess townscapes in the case of this one, can always benefit from a wide stereo base. It's a view of the world that you don't get in 2D films, you don't get it in real life, you only get in 3D films. There's another shot that you often see in 3D films, which is either put in for the benefit of 3D, or the 3D simply shows it off excellently, and it's an entirely valid shot that's used in 2D films all the time, but for me it's almost 3D porn, and that's the view looking down on somebody climbing up a ladder. It massively helps to make heights look scary, and generally in a film I think if somebody is climbing a ladder then there's usually meant to be at least some level of tension. So these are maybe a couple of my favourite 3D shots in the film. Tunnels are another thing that also lend themselves to naturally and almost effortlessly look good in 3D because of their natural depth and perspective, and this shot here is a nice example of that. Maybe one of the most creative 3D moments in the film, where its use appears to have been very carefully considered, is this scene where we get the camera moving in on the kid's face as he's looking at a clown doll, and this shot looks almost completely flat, and I know that Max Penner knows exactly how to shoot a close-up face in 3D, but here the boy's face has very little discernible depth to it. But in the very next shot, which is of the scary doll, in the same sort of level of close-up as the kid, we get a really strong 3D. So the change from a flat face to a scary face with exaggerated depth is really effective, and I think it's quite clever stuff. And by way of demonstrating that they absolutely do know how to film a close-up in strong 3D, we get this shot of one of the leads in the moment after he's seen something disturbing, and probably for the first time in the film we see a face with really strong depth. So again, it's an effective use of saving your strongest 3D for the most powerful dramatic moments. I'll just take a very brief moment to put up this shot, not because the 3D is remotely impressive, but because it's the extremely brief scene, uncredited and with no dialogue, from the legendary Dick Miller, who was, I think he was in all of Joe Dante's films, as well as over 150 other films, including his superb scene as the gun store guy in The Terminator. And I'm not sure, but I think that out of that huge number of films, this one was one of his very last appearances, but also I think it was his only appearance that I'm aware of in a 3D film. So that's a lot of positives for the 3D, but I do feel it's worth pointing out a couple of what I see as possibly less impressive things. First of all, I'd say that overall this is a good 3D film, but maybe not a top-tier great one. Whilst there are many great moments that I've mentioned, I'd say that the film as a whole has its 3D set at a very natural level. In other words, for the most part it shows the world in the same level of depth that you'd see if you were there. And for some people that's exactly what 3D should do, but for me I prefer it to be pushed a little bit stronger than normal human stereo vision for a bit more of the time. For example, we get a sequence on this rickety looking old roller coaster, which is a structure that could look incredible in 3D, but here it looks pretty much how you'd see it if you were there, which isn't very interesting from a stereoscopic point of view. Also, it's in the same sequence that we get this one brief shot, which to me looks entirely flat. It's the only shot in the film that is flat, and I know many 3D films have this happen from time to time. So in a way I'd mark this as a positive, that the whole film is clearly three-dimensional, apart from this one shot. There are a couple of scenes featuring floating or flying feathers and particles, again something which can look spectacular in 3D, but not much is made of them here. I suspect that in both of these cases it would have been inappropriate to dwell on the shot from a storytelling point of view, but from a 3D point of view it would have been nice if they'd had a bit more depth. Lastly, this shot, nothing wrong with it at all. There's clearly something in the foreground, and the shallow depth of field is very cinematic, of course. The out of focus lights are all sitting in the same 3D space, which is exactly where you'd expect them to be in a natively filmed 3D shot. But this shot reminded me of a moment in the post-converted 3D film Need for Speed, where out-of-focus background lights are placed at various different depths, creating a really dazzlingly beautiful piece of 3D, which I think I mentioned in my review of that film's 3D, that you wouldn't get the effect if you filmed it natively, which this film demonstrates nicely. Just a very quick word on the film itself. I really liked it. I think it was a bit of a comeback to the cinema for Joe Dante when he made this, and he's almost always been someone to rely on for quality and slightly offbeat films. It's about three kids who experience the strange consequences of discovering a mysterious cavernous hole in the basement of the house that they've just moved into, and Dante manages to make this child-friendly film genuinely scary. There are good performances from the three young leads, there's a great turn from Bruce Dern, and the story is perfectly entertaining. Just a final word on the Blu-ray. After watching the film I had a look at the fairly weak selection of extras, and when watching clips from the film in 2D immediately after seeing them in 3D, and this is always a sign of a good 3D film, the concept of 2D cinema just seems to be crazy. The flatness of it just looks wrong. There's so much missing. And also, amongst the making of materials, there's a moment where the lead actress, Hayley Bennett, says that the film is multi-dimensional and also three-dimensional. And I mention that because it's the only time the fact that the film was shot in 3D is mentioned throughout the entirety of the extras, which feels like a really strange omission and a bit of a missed opportunity. Anyway, I think that this is one of those films that's quite well known amongst 3D fans, but not so much elsewhere. I'd definitely recommend it, both for the movie itself and for the 3D. So I hope you've found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.